to get to the topics of change and conflict this hour. So we're looking forward to that and leading through change and dealing with conflict. And the first conflict is, what am I going to do while I wait for him? Where is he? That's all right. Let's see. You know why you won't? You know why you always take two pastors fishing with you? Because if you only take one, he'll drink all your beer. It wasn't a very good joke, huh? I thought maybe it would be, but you got it, huh? Good. You don't get it? Two pastors are trying to impress each other with why they won't drink beer. You only take one, he'll drink all your beer. I first heard that joke told about Baptists. It makes more sense then. You could say that. Good. Good. Well, I hope you're enjoying yourself and learning a lot. Um, when John comes in, somebody needs to say, John, we'd just like to know, how important is punctuality for a leader? Okay. You want me to do that, or is one of you going to do it? Okay. That's all right. Huh? That's a good idea. Yeah, I'm the guy who has to learn about that. You know, I teach a class here on Monday mornings on leadership, and I'd love for any of you who have insights that you'd like to give the students. There's students here about mistakes that you've made or things that you've learned as leaders. It'd be fantastic to have you drop in, and you just drop in and tell me you're there, and I'll give you 15 minutes. Okay, and then after you go, if you said something I don't agree with, we'll clean it up after you leave. So, John, uh, welcome. I just have a question for you. I wonder uh, uh, how much of your leadership credibility depends on punctuality.
I guess not much.
We made him do that.
Yeah.
You can blame us.
I just say it's just another model today of abusive leadership. Okay, so I think you have notes there on change? See that? It says session 6, but it's really not 6. But y'all have, did they get out to everybody? So the basic laws in bringing change, that's what I hope you can find. Did you find it? Okay, we were going to get, okay, they are coming? Okay, all right. Okay, so they're, oh, here they are. Good. Hey, while they're doing that really quick, I'm going to just start right here, and I'm not going to remember names, but tell everybody your name, and if you're in a leadership role, what is it, or maybe you're training for one, but just real quick. So,
Rudy Volkovich, director of St. Teresa's Camp, 10 miles.
okay. 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 Yeah. And just speak a little louder so everybody can hear. And you are.
Chris Spitzer, I'm one of the elders at Riverside Bible Church.
Okay.
Brian Larson, I go to Bible Church.
Yeah. Very good. And you are.
Jesse Huck, I'm also one of the elders at Bible Church.
Okay. Elder and youth director. Yeah. Yeah.
Ted Frankie and Service Ministries and Scholastics Christian National Academy. Brian Cody, worship leader at Lakeview Bible Church, director at Milwaukee. Jonathan Garland, former professor here at the college and currently at Church on the Rock staff. Dave Whipple, computer training.
Yeah. Good. Not just a student. student training, preparing for leadership, right? Yeah. Okay. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And right for the what? Okay. Yeah. Maybe right over with. Okay. Yeah. Great. And- Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Welcome. Wow. Lots of leaders in this midst here. So, we ended last night by talking about the fact that leaders bring an organization to get clarity on their mission, which in ministry we don't have to create. It's there for us. We just need to know how to language it. And then we talked about vision, which we do have to be more intentional to create. And a vision. Somebody tell us how you distinguish a mission and a vision again. A mission answers what question? Why? Why are we here? And the vision is answering the question, where? So where are we going? And the strategy is answering the question, how, right? And then the tactics are answering who. And so I made a point yesterday that when you get these all together, a mission, a vision, you get clarity on your strategy, your game plan, and your tactics. It's when you get to accountability that you then have the real possibility of execution. So a lot of churches just have a lot of ministries. Well, a lot of leaders, a lot of organizations have a lot of strategy statements and mission statements and vision statements, but very little execution. And so I was making the point last night that execution really, they've discovered execution really doesn't happen until there's accountability. And that accountability has to be led by the leader who therefore keeps people's feet to the fire. And if you don't do that, there's a good chance it just won't happen. So now let's assume you've been leading your organization and people have got a clarity about the mission and they can see where you're going. And there's a sense of we're doing this strategically, wisely, carefully. We've got clear tactics. We know who's, and we have the assignables. And wow, we're starting to see it happen. Then comes change, right? And with change often comes with conflict. So I want to talk about change. It seems like it's important to do this. And so you'll see there on your notes, change, leadership and change are like joint travelers on the same road. In fact, I think it's a fair statement to say if you say you're leading an organization and there's not change, I would say you're not leading an organization. You may think you're leading, but because true leadership is going to bring change. Because true leaders are not interested in maintaining the status quo. They're not interested in coming in and just making sure the lights are on and thermostats set and people are happy. And those aren't leaders. Leaders are those who have a sense of direction, they're dreaming, they're thinking out there, and that brings change. And when we look in Scripture, we see that just about every leader brought change. Give me some examples. David, yeah. So David changes where God's presence is going to be. He brings the ark into Jerusalem. He brings lots of changes. Who else? Jethro. Bring a change to Moses in terms of how Moses does his leadership. Right. So in that sense, Jethro's a leader. What change did Moses bring? Oh, he brought lots of change, right? And one could go on. Nehemiah, Esther put her life on the line to change the king's edict. Jeremiah, Jesus laid his life on the line to change the status quo. You could say, is this a fair statement? Let me ask you. Was Jesus the ultimate disruptor? I mean, if there's anybody that didn't maintain the status quo, it was Jesus. In fact, he took on the status quo, starting with the religious leaders who were all about status quo. And so he was the ultimate disruptor. He got there in the Sermon on the Mount and said, what? You have heard that it was said, but change. Things are different. I have not come to bring what? Peace, but a sword. I was telling the guys at lunch, I read a fascinating article by David Brooks, a New York Times columnist. Hope I can say this. I might get in trouble. I hope not. But David Brooks said it. I didn't. But David Brooks is a wonderful writer who writes for the New York Times, who's Jewish, but I think has come to Jesus. He's just enamored with Jesus, and you see that in his latest book. But he wrote an article about a week ago for some blog site on Jesus. It was a masterpiece. But along the way, he said, David Brooks' words, Jesus was the ultimate badass. And now, that sounds bad. But he's simply making the point that Jesus stepped into situations not to make people necessarily feel comfortable, not to give people a sense of same old, right? He came in and he just brought change. I think one of my favorite stories is Nicodemus, who thinks they're just going to go through sort of the motions here and kind of compare notes, and Jesus just turns his life upside down. So this is what leaders do. We're change agents. So if somebody criticizes you for bringing change, first of all, just tell them, I'm in really great company, because that's what leaders do in Scripture. So some basic rules, though, about change. We can do change really badly, or we can do change really well. So you'll find there on your notes some basic rules. Did I leave blanks here? That's good, because now you have to really pay attention, which is really important after lunch. So here's the first thing. First thing is make sure people know why you're bringing change. John Cotter, who's written a lot on change. If you want to read a book on change, look at John Cotter. He said, by far the biggest mistake people make when trying to change organizations is to plunge ahead without establishing a sense of urgency, without establishing a reason. Let me just put it this way, I've learned through hard experience. If you say to people, I just want to bring change for change's sake, that just really annoys people. Really annoys people. Don't do that. There's got to be a clear reason behind change. Here's the second. And this is really important, of course, and that's to involve people through change. So as you've involved followers through mission and vision and strategies and objectives, involve them through the process. And what that means is single out the influencers. Influencers, here's another way to describe them: people with disproportionate power due to their connections, maybe the years they've been in the organization, due to their ability to persuade. But sometimes we have to go to someone and to say, look, you can do this far better than I can, but I need you to talk. I need you to talk to Ann. Ann's just not there, and you're the one that could convince her. So we have to do this as a team effort. Someone put it this way: involve if you hope to evolve. Thirdly, okay, this is what we don't want to hear, but anticipate resistance. Because when we bring change, people will resist for lots of reasons. I mentioned this book, Canoeing the Mountains. This guy's done a lot of research and thinking on ministry and leadership. And this is what he wrote in his introduction. He said, listen to these words, 1,500 pastors leave the ministry every month. 1,500 pastors leave the ministry every month. And this is what he said. The common thread is that they got worn down by trying to bring change. He just said, I'm just done. Does that surprise you? The number's kind of surprising, isn't it? But the reason doesn't surprise me. Because bringing change is a lot of hard work. So anticipate resistance. And what's behind resistance? There's a couple things here I put. One is fear. People really are fearful of change. They like things to stay the same. They realize that the world's going to change. Things won't be as they are. We're moving into the unpredictable. Things are feeling unstable. People, a big part of fear is the fear of losing control. Losing familiarity. Change brings a certain disequilibrium. So people will fear the loss of identity. In my first church, I moved from one service to 2 services. Oh my gosh, that was huge. And people said, but we're going to be 2 churches now. We're not going to be the same church. We're not going to see our friends anymore. There were all kinds of fears. And some of them were true. Because in one sense, when you bring change, the world is passing away, isn't it? It's just the nature of it. I was so excited to move to the Netherlands. I remember I got on the plane, left Portland, flew to Seattle, and then flew across the ocean. And I was just feeling great. I told everyone goodbye. And suddenly, just like out of the blue, I realized the world had just passed away. It'll never be the same again. That's hard. So it's natural that there's going to be resistance. Another reason for resistance is, let's face it, for some people, it's just laziness. Because change is interrupting routine. When we change the routine, people have to think, and lots of people don't like to think. As I said yesterday, we're splashing cold water on one's complacency. There's another one that gets behind resistance, and that's confusion, because change is about ideas. And one more is just this entrenched mistrust. So the fourth rule of change is to handle resistance wisely. See that? Handle resistance wisely. So what does that mean exactly? Well, you tell me. How do you handle resistance wisely? What do you do? Yeah.
I mean, you need to take it under consideration. Like, maybe the resistance is on the mark. Maybe your grand idea is
Yeah. That's certainly one. Yeah, part of handling resistance wisely is paying attention to the capacity of people to change. Paying attention to the ripple effect. Watching misjudgments, overestimating how much you can do to bring change, or underestimating how hard it is to move people into change. Yeah. Yeah.
We are doing this together. This is not me doing this. Let's
Right.
work together for
Right. But as I said yesterday, starting with getting them to feel the same pain you feel that's bringing about, needs to bring about the change. Um, I'm going to guess for a lot of you in this room, it disturbs you how ineffective the church has become, how less influential the church is in culture. I would guess that many of you find it disturbing. And so you find yourself as a leader saying, we've got to do something about this. I've got to teach my people how to engage in culture, because people don't know how to engage in culture. I've got to help people see that we have the best arguments. Now you feel that, we should feel that anyway, but it could be that a lot of our people don't feel that. So somehow we have to get them to feel that. We have to get them to see what could be if the church doesn't wake up. So that's part of involving people.
I just mentioned something in that dealing with the resistance wisely, instead of getting up to the game, as it were, beginning with the assumption that I'm dealing with somebody most likely in most situations who loves the Lord, who's trustworthy, and whose carefulness reflects a passion that, if leveraged properly, may actually contribute to our ultimate direction.
Right. Yeah, so finding how you can make people who resist you get on your side, right? I mentioned Jim, the one who sees only with structural glasses. Remember that guy? And one day I thought, you know what? I need to get Jim on the elder board. We'd bring something to the congregation, and it's all going well, and then Jim would stand up, with his Constitution. And I thought, it'd make a lot more sense if we were dealing with Jim around a table as elders and staff than out in the congregation. So Jim came on the board, and man, it was so great, because we'd be working through something we were going to bring to the congregation and say, well, Jim would say, well, have you considered this? And we'd make the adjustments. And then when we got to the congregation, Jim was like a chief cheerleader. So, that part of it is getting people who resist you on your side, and it's part of it is building trust. And though I learned this later, my first introduction to Jim, I was a new pastor. I went over to meet him in his work, and he said, well, Pastor, I want you to know something. I always shoot straight. And after 10 years working with Jim, if I could go back to that first meeting, I'd go, how about if we just don't shoot? So it's not always great that people shoot straight. So here's something else I put here, E, and that is respect the past. Now, I touched on this last hour, but the losses will be a lot less if you find the story and build on it, as I said. So we have a tendency to be oblivious to this. We want to pay attention to our own story, our own chapter. but I can't emphasize this enough. If I was starting as a pastor today, like I said, one of the first things I do is find out the story. In fact, even in the candidating process, I would say, I need to know, I want to read the story. Recently, Dan, I was an interim pastor after I retired. I was an interim teaching pastor. All they really wanted me to do was teach. It was like all the pastoring without the pain. It was wonderful. I should have done it for 33 years. But this church was 60 years old. And so having learned from my mistakes, one of the first things I did as I worked with them for a year and a half is I read their history. I knew their history better than they knew their history. And so it served as a context at times when I challenged the church to think about something and just bring them back to their DNA. So part of change is to respect the past, and it will come so much better. Here's the fifth or sixth one. Leave. Do you have leave? Leave some things the same. Yeah, people like some change. I think it was about 4 days ago. I think this is what it was. I was eating some Fig Newtons. Now, I noticed on the package it said new and improved. You discover that? How many times packaging has that? New and improved. And sometimes I'm just thinking, they just put that on there. They didn't really do anything. It's the same Fig Newtons. Hasn't really changed. But why do marketers put new and improved? Maybe that's part of it. Yeah. So that's good. And it's a lot of it is marketing. We are attracted to things that are new, but part of a rule of change is leave some things the same. Don't try to completely change a product, for example, like they did with Coca-Cola. It's before some of your time, but remember when they came out with New Coke? So they did these taste testers, down in Atlanta where Coca-Cola is based, and they had people taste Pepsi and taste Coke without knowing which is which. And most of the taste testers preferred Pepsi. So that Coca-Cola realized they needed to change the formula. Now, I can totally understand because my dad worked for Coca-Cola. And so I used to, as a kid, ride the routes with him. And I was the kid who, back with pre-mix machines, I know this really dates me, I would be the taste tester. Okay, yeah, Dad, I think it's got it right now. So I just grew up on Coke. But what my dad didn't know was that, does that sound right? But but I used to go to the movie theater as a kid, and I loved it because they served Pepsi. The point is you get used to a taste and something else tastes better. So they came out with this big marketing campaign, New Coke. You remember that? Big change. Total disaster. And it was a total disaster. They misread. They tried to do too much. And sometimes we can do the same thing with change. Where wisdom says to change and alter a few things, we come in with sort of a scorched earth policy. We're just going to burn everything down. It's like there was a pastor I worked with in Portland. He went to the first Willow Creek Summit. This was an older conservative Baptist church. His name was Chuck. And remember, he came home from that first conference and he said, I'm changing things up here in my church. So he physically, I don't know how he did this, he physically removed the organ. He changed the whole stage. He changed how he dressed. He changed the whole way he's going to use his style and do worship. Chuck was looking for a ministry 6 months later. Because this is what happens. He decided it's all or nothing. But wisdom is when you bring change in a ministry, just first of all, just start slow and be wise and perceptive and careful. See how people are. Here's what happens. For a lot of us in ministry, it's like playing Monopoly. If I could use this illustration, when you play Monopoly, at least how we've played Monopoly, is everybody gets a couple $500 bills and a couple 100s and a couple 50s. Is that how it happens with you? So you think you're rich, right? Because you have all this money. And so you go around the board and you're buying all the properties up. And then you realize, wow, I didn't do that very well. And people in ministry do the same thing. You get monopoly money when you start off. We sometimes call it a leader's honeymoon. But what you start thinking is, man, I'm rich. These people are going to follow me anywhere. And then you realize you just got monopoly money. And it doesn't last very long. The wisdom of change is always ask yourself this question: how many chips do I have in the bank? Because every time you bring change, think of it as a withdrawal, right? When you bring change, you're withdrawing something from your account. So you got to make sure you have enough money in the account. And what a huge mistake a leader can make is to bring change, but he didn't have enough money in the account. Without going into any real details, my successor in my last church came in sort of a scorched earth policy, has brought huge change. Asked the worship leader to leave, has removed almost all of the staff. The reality is he doesn't have enough chips in the bank. So now he's running in the red, so to speak. He's overdrawn. So let me ask you a question. How do you put money in the bank? What does the deposit look like? So just over time, establishing trust, right? What else is a deposit in the bank? You deposit in the bank when you visit that person in the hospital, when you're there with your pastoral, your ministerial presence when someone's really hurting. People don't forget those things. You're there if you're faithfully teaching week after week and there's consistency, and people know that when you speak, they're going to hear something from God. Those are huge deposits. So over time, hopefully you make some great deposits, because if you're a true leader, you know you're going to have to make some big withdrawals. So in my church, for example, I came to a point to realize we've got to build a new sanctuary. I was preaching 5 times every weekend. Couldn't sustain this forever. And so we went through all the work to tear down and build. That's a major withdrawal from the bank. I would have been a fool to have done that the first year, or even maybe the 5th year. So, and then even part of that was establishing what things must we keep the same. So sometimes wisdom might call for an initial rearranging of the bushes, so to speak. Don't do a major landscape when you start off. So the question is, well, how long before I start bringing change? Well, there might be some changes you need to make initially right from the start. But always gauge where things are at in the bank account, so to speak. Let me stop for a moment because this is a really important point. I want to make sure you're hearing me. You understand what I'm saying? Dan, you must have had to work through that, think in a way about your account, right? Yeah. Yeah. But what if it was Grace Baptist Church? Yeah. 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 Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. A certain respect of tradition, but on the time, at the same time, helping people to be open to the moving of the Spirit. Um, yes. Oh yeah. 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 Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Again, it goes back to knowing the history. It goes back to establishing a vision uh, collaboratively, so that people feel like they're part of this. Aim for the 80% is the next one. When I say aim for the 80%, it might be if you aim for 100%, you may never bring change. I don't know it's as if the changes I've brought in my ministry ever got 100%. Sometimes the church will try to anticipate by change by putting things in their constitution that will keep you from doing that. Like I remember we had a church covenant in my first church. My first church gave me lots of stories. But we had a covenant we would read together when we took communion. The problem with the covenant was that it was written in 1947. So you can imagine the language. I mean, there were words that I had no idea what they meant. Holy deportment. So we without changing the essence or the meaning at all, we just changed to update the language. We brought it to the church. We'd spent weeks on it and just assured people. I mean, this is how resistant to change this church was. We brought this to the body, and all but 2 people voted yes. So it failed. Because the Constitution had been carefully crafted that in this congregationally led church, that decisions had to be unanimous. Now, it sounds sort of nice, but it was actually a strategy to keep things from change. In fact, I remember this particular one. I was just furious. I was, because we had put so much work in this, and I was walking out, and as I was walking out, there were two men in front of me. I recognized these two older men because they had so resisted change. And I overheard this man say to Wayne, "So what did you vote?" And Wayne said, "I voted no." And he said, "So why did you vote no?" And Wayne said, you know what he said? "I always vote no." And so then Wayne asked this guy, "Why did you vote no?" And I'll never forget this. The guy said, "I don't know." God forbid that you are led into that kind of church. But I'm just saying, if you're wondering if I have some credibility to talk about change, I've been through some of that. I think in God's humor, he took me to the Netherlands where things change every 5 minutes with an expat congregation to just show me what life is like on the other side. So what you do is what? You aim for the 80%. At some point, the train has to leave the station. And as I said, our tendency is to wait for everyone to get on board. But if you do, you may lose some of your very best people. So when is it time to leave? When you find yourself repeating issues over and over. I read this somewhere that the Marines have a 70% rule. If you have 70% of the information, have done 70% of the analysis, and feel 70% confident, move. People like, though, sometimes another ploy people will use to thwart change is analysis. Well, we just need to study it a little bit more. And there's nothing wrong with analysis until it becomes a habit, just becomes a pattern. I could be wrong. I maybe could be wrong about this when I think theologically, but I think part of the reason that Moses and Israel went through the wilderness is because of analysis. God said, "Here's the land, let's go." And they said, "We need a committee meeting. We need to do a further study." Well, wait, no, God said that he will go before us. He'll take care of the giants. He said the land is what? Filled with milk and honey. But they had to send a committee to see if there were giants and to see if the land had milk and honey. So guess what happens? Just like happens often in committees, it led to a certain paralysis. Now, I could be wrong. Moses might meet me at the gate and go, "Wow, no, that's not the way," but it sure seems like it. Okay, so here's the next one. Be wise with early successes. So when you do see change and it begins to happen, help people realize that they can be affirmations of worthwhileness, but let people catch their breath. Celebrate achievements. You've maybe established a can-do attitude, and that's really good. But as I've said before, consistent change, constant change leads to constant tension. The other thing is, don't read too much in early successes. So, for example, we had a successful building campaign. Oh, did we read a little bit too much into that? Because we assumed if you build it, they will come. Well, guess what? They didn't come. Now, we never said to people, if we build it, it will lead to church, but everybody assumed that. So be wise with your early successes. This can be another important rule of change. Here's one that's really hard, but it's true, is expect losses. Because change is a mixture of addition and subtraction. Did we gain new people when we built our new sanctuary? Yeah, we did. Did we lose people? Yeah. We lost people who said, I miss the old sanctuary. We lost people who said, I don't want to be part of this debt. We lost people who just didn't like a feel of change. So, what do you do with that? Here's what you need to write down in your notes. Anticipate it. When you bring change, just anticipate loss. Don't let it throw you. Rejoice in the gain and bear up the loss. Allow people to find a different place. It's okay. But don't compromise the vision to try to keep everybody. Okay, finally, be willing to reconsider. Sometimes the most important change is the change we need to make the change. So it just may not be the time, may not be the right people. So my 10 years in my first church, I had to reconsider the fact that my dream for this church wasn't going to happen. It just wasn't going to happen. As much as I wanted to, as much as I wanted to devote my life to the church, it just wasn't going to happen. I always remember one of the last weeks before I left for Europe, actually before I resigned, I want you to imagine this. We had talked about moving to a far better situation because the church was in a really bad geographic situation. There came a week when I received a letter from a major development. Actually, it was the cemetery that owned all the land on this hill that we'd always had our eyes on. And we had approached them, and I got a letter one week and said, we'll sell you 10 acres, $5,000 an acre. You have 24 hours. At the same time, that same week, a Russian congregation had moved into the area where our church was and said, we will pay you cash for your church. And my elder said, we need more time. And I could see it just wasn't going to happen. So you may come to this and you may have to give up a dream, and it's okay. I knew at that point someone else would have to lead the church forward. The sad thing I share with you is about a year and a half ago, the church closed its doors and died. People resisted change, and so when they grew old and died, the church died. So I'm not giving you these laws to say, so you're going to be, you're going to be successful. Maybe you will be. You bring change and it works, and things go forward. So challenges. Let's switch gears here and talk about some of the challenges. So again, prepare for them in ministry, because ministry is a mix of joy and wonder and heartbreak and sabotage and difficulties. I don't know any leader in Scripture that didn't go through it, right? Every leader goes through it. Max Dupree once said, expect to have your chins bruised and your knees skinned. Or Ruth Haley Barton, who said, the leader always gets voted off the island. So there will be calm days, and there will be storms and conflicts. As long as the institutions are made of people, that will happen. There will be mistakes and controversies and misunderstandings. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say for some of you here, maybe you're going through conflict and difficulty right now. Here's what I want you to know. You're not alone. And you're in good company, really good company. And it's not unique. It's part of ministry. And they come, they come for several reasons, and here they are. I think you see where I'm at on your notes? They come because, first of all, leaders are at the front of the pack. They come to us because we're visible. And when you're visible, someone once said you will be scrutinized, idolized, and criticized. So if you sign up to be a leader, just know this, that you haven't signed up to be loved by everybody. Leaders aren't loved by everybody. And sometimes the pain is that the people you most thought would love you won't love you. It works the opposite way as well. But there are just some people that will just resist because you're the one in front. This guy, Wayne, I just mentioned. Wayne, right from the start, determined he didn't like me. He didn't like me because this was his church, this 80-year-old church. And Wayne had been there all of his life. So the very first Sunday I preached, about halfway through, Wayne gets up, he walks out, goes down the aisle, and he says, "I can't hear the man." And this was Wayne for 10 years. It's what I live with. But I began to realize, okay, so what do I do with Wayne? Well, I could just, I wanted sometimes to just physically toss him out. Until one day I went over to Wayne's house. And the oddest thing happened. Wayne invited me in like a grandfather. Took me downstairs, showed me his albums. He was a photographer. And Wayne and I were just like this until Sundays came. Because I discovered the church was his turf. I was always Wayne's threat. But when I was on his turf, not that the church was my turf, but when I was on his turf at home, not a problem at all. I think there's memorable things you remember people say to you. And my last Sunday when I left after 10 years, Wayne came up to me and I drove over to his house to say goodbye. And Wayne, in his own classic way, said, "You know, Pastor, I hated you when you came. And now I hate you that you're leaving." And I was thinking, wow, there were some people you just can't win. So, right? I don't know what I said. They come also because, secondly, people don't easily follow. Because let's face it, we all have an instinctive rebelliousness in us, right? I don't know anyone that doesn't have something of that. A certain rebellion towards authority. So don't be surprised if people resist. It's part of our rebellious nature. We have this tendency to fight. They come, thirdly, because, as I mentioned earlier, we bring a plan, a change. They come fourth because leadership is confrontational by nature, because it's will meeting will. One's leading, one's following, often resisting. So it's part of the nature of leadership. They killed the prophets because there is something of a propheticness in true leadership. You're confronting change, you're confronting sin, you're confronting bad habits, and people will often resist that. So leadership is, as one put it, always a struggle, often a feud. They come fifth because we're trafficking truth. And sometimes people hate that because truth defines reality. And people sometimes don't want to live in reality. Sometimes you have to say really hard things. They're true. Sometimes we may have to say, this church is dying. And that will be hard for some people. Sometimes you just have to stand up when you see something wrong. And it's not always going to be received well. There was this man, my first church, Harold Bangs. My first congregational meeting, Harold Bangs got into it with the church moderator. And in fact, they sounded like junior high kids. Harold Bangs said, "I'll see you outside in the parking lot," and used some language that, let's just say, wasn't so holy. So I called Harold Bangs into my office and I said, "Harold, I don't know you very well. I'm the new pastor. I just want you to know, I look at business meetings like I look at worship services. There's something of holiness. This is God's work. And Harold said, I'll never forget, Harold looked at me and he said, I'll damn well do whatever I want to do. And then he proceeded to basically just use all the language one could imaginable. Sometimes when we're trafficking truth and we're having to speak to things people don't want to hear, there's going to be pushback. They come because we're leading the church where the challenges are great. So what's the wisdom in responding to challenges? So here, let me give you a couple here before our break. The first thing in responding to challenges is, now write this down. This is so important. Face them. Don't hide from them. I can't tell you how many leaders that will say to me, well, I know I'm not so great with conflict. I hate conflict. Well, really? I don't know anybody who likes conflict. Just because you hate conflict doesn't give you a license to avoid conflict. So you have to face them. Don't hide from them. Don't live in denial. Don't live in the dark. Here's a second one. And, oh, well, there's so much could be said about this. See where I'm at? What does it say? What does your page say? Avoid demonizing your opponents. Avoid turning differences into spiritual war. You know what I'm talking about? How do we do that? How do people do that in the church? They're really good at doing this. Well, Pastor, I know that this is what God wants us to do. And in that moment, they have put you in a position of arguing with who? With God. Or, well, I know that the devil's behind this. Or we use all of this language that oftentimes just raises and elevates the temperature. And we think it comes off as spiritual. And oftentimes what it does is it elevates the issue way, way, way out of proportion. I could be wrong in this, but I think Christians have perhaps far more difficulty resolving conflict than pagans because they have this tendency to do this. Because once people go down that road, I've had to say to people, don't misunderstand me, but can we leave God out of it? Now you can misunderstand what I'm saying there, but do you understand what I'm saying? Because once we start using that language, we've elevated things, and it becomes almost impossible to come to some resolution. Y'all face that? Had that happen to you? Well, have you ever done that? Yeah. We've all done that. The last one I'll give before break is avoid responding defensively. This is really hard, I know. It's our inclination. It's the first instinct of a leader to respond defensively. But it's generally the worst response. Now, how do you avoid responding defensively? How do you do that? Yeah.
You might be right. You might have some proof.
Yeah.
I think Jesus said he did not entrust himself because he knew what was in the heart of man. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't some, downplay on man's potential or how much he loved man. But I think there was some wisdom there in just recognizing that as I lead, there will be resistance. Yeah. And I'm leaving So in my mind, when that encounter takes place, it doesn't crash through my worldview of how relationships take place.
Mhm.
They're essentially trials.
Yeah. It's a lot of humility, isn't it? I mean, we have to bite our tongues sometimes. We want to respond defensively. I'll just say one more thing, because I think this is something helped me one day a lot. And it was a friend of mine who worked for the Postal Union. He was an arbitrator, a lawyer, and in a situation with huge conflict. So he was often criticized, and this is what he shared with me something he learned to do, and I started doing it, and it was really helpful. Somebody comes to you and criticizes you, and your first thought is to say, "Wait, I'm not like." That elder chair I talked about in the Netherlands. One day he marched into my office and he looked me in the eye and he said, "You're the most autocratic man I've ever met." Now, my first inclination was to get defensive. "I'm not autocratic." Well, no, that obviously wouldn't have gone over too well. But I thought, what do I do? And here's what my friend taught me, is to say something like this. When you're maligned, criticized, just try this. Say to the person, "You know, I don't know if that's true. It could be true, but here's what I want to ask you. I want you to allow me a little bit of space to talk to 2 or 3 people who know me really well, who would be completely honest with me. Let me ask them, am I the most autocratic man on earth? Is there even a layer of autocraticness to my leadership? And then I'd like to get back and talk about it with you." Now that was a practice he started that he found was really helpful in conversations. It makes sense, doesn't it? So as opposed to just getting defensive. So that's one way to deal with conflict. I think that's real helpful. So, okay, so we're going to come back at 7, right, Dan? And we'll finish up talking about change, and we'll move to talk about transition.
Yeah, I want to encourage you again. Tonight's session will be really practical, particularly for those who are probably